All right, maybe we'll get started. Thank you all for coming out tonight on behalf of the George Washington Forum on American Ideas, Politics, and Institutions. It's my great pleasure tonight to welcome you to the opening of the conference on the Great Depression Revisited. Tonight's first plenary session is Risks and Rewards. The Washington Forum is a civic education initiative and intellectual diversity initiative here at Ohio University. It's a forum, not a program. And it's a program that welcomes academic contrarians, especially those contrarians willing to argue for their positions publicly and to debate their opponents openly, forthrightly, and civilly. The forum's just now beginning its third year of operation. In addition to sponsoring postdoctoral undergraduate fellowships and visiting speakers, we each year put on a themed conference on problems in American and Western civilization. In 2010, we hosted an event on violence in the American Revolution, and next year we'll do one on God and the Enlightenment. This year's conference, though, concerns neither metaphysics nor the distant past. Instead, it focuses on the causes and consequences of the Great Depression of the 1930s. Its impetus should be evident: the current financial crisis in which we now live, or rather, the financial crisis in which we have been living for nearly a half-decade now. Once it became clear to everyone a few years ago that something disturbingly distinctive was going on in the economy, I, like most people, started to read the financial commentary in newspapers and to pay attention to financial news channels far more than I had previously. Three things struck me. First, nearly everyone I heard or read seemed to agree that this was the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. Second, those very same commentators couldn't agree on the lessons of the Great Depression. Even those themselves who had Nobel Prizes in economics seemed unable to reach a consensus. When I read the New York Times editorial page, I'd learned the lesson that Nobelists like Paul Krugman and Joseph Stiglitz adduced from the Great Depression. But when I read the Wall Street Journal editorial page, I learned a different set of lessons, which Nobelists like Vernon Smith and Gary Becker adduced from the 1930s economic crisis. The third thing that struck me was that the commentary on the current economic crisis and its analog, the Great Depression, was highly politicized and at times deeply personal. Let me put this in perspective. No one I know who studies the South Sea Bubble financial crisis of the 1720s is willing to go to the mat to defend his interpretation of that event. People who study the politics and economics of the Great Depression, by contrast, seemed pretty ready to pick up the short knives in defense of their views. 18th century British economic historians reckon that their work has little, if any, contemporary relevance. Scholars of the 1930s economic crisis, not so much. So out of those three things, the Great Depression is analog, the lack of consensus concerning its lessons, and the favorable discussions about it, emerged the idea for this conference. What if, I wondered, we could bring together some of the very best economists and historians who studied the Great Depression for a discussion? And what if we assembled a group that had genuine intellectual diversity? What if we could get Keynesians and Austrians, New Deal defenders and New Deal detractors, to break bread privately and to debate their views publicly? It seemed to me like a good idea at the time. It seems to me like an even better one today. In order for that idea to become a reality, we needed three things. The first was money. Thankfully, there were a number of private foundations willing to help. Most importantly, the Thomas W. Smith Foundation gave the Washington Forum a $300,000 challenge grant, part of which is helping to pay for this conference. In addition, the Apgar Foundation and the Charles Koch Foundation have chipped in to sponsor this gathering. Put another way, it's precisely because of Tom Smith, the Apgar family, and Charles Koch that we've been able to put on a conference that's exemplary, not just for the quality of the speakers participating in it, but also for its political and intellectual diversity. I'd be remiss as well if I didn't thank Steve Miner, director of the Contemporary History Institute here at Ohio University, for chipping in with timely help when it was becoming clear that we might top our financial levy. I appreciate Steve for his generous assistance, and I'm glad to have the chance to acknowledge his help publicly tonight. In addition to money to pull off the conference, the second thing we needed was a group of first-rate scholars of all political and ideological hues to agree to participate. We began by inviting a select few to give plenary addresses before issuing a general call for papers. I think one would be hard-pressed to find a more impressive gathering of historians and economists who study the Great Depression than the group of plenary speakers we have here with us this week. We'll be introducing each of them at much greater length in their individual plenary sessions, but I want at the outset of the conference to recognize and to thank Tony Badger, Brian Ballow, David Beto, Brian Domitrovic, Gowdy Egertson, Lon Hamby, Leo Hanian, Eric Rauschway, and Amity Shlaes for agreeing to deliver addresses to this conference. In an act of shameless self-promotion on their behalf, I'd like to note that the Little Professor Book Center will be selling their books throughout the conference at a table right outside the conference venue. If you like what you hear from one or another of our speakers, stimulate their individual economies by buying their books. The third and final thing we needed to make this conference reality was someone foolish enough to want to run it. Luckily, there was such a person in Paul Milazzo, Associate Professor of History here at Ohio University, and someone who's now writing a biography of the prominent free market journalist Henry Hazlitt. Paul's the intellectual architect of this gathering. No Paul, no conference. There are also a number of others, including Sherry Glogly, Matt Jacobs, and Jasper Verschoor, who did the unseen things without which no effort like this can succeed. And finally, I need to thank Richard Vedder for his advice and assistance in this venture. I appreciate all of their hard work to help pull off this event. And now to tonight's speaker. The first session is on risks and rewards. As with all of our plenary speakers, there will be ample time afterwards to ask questions, and we'll have microphones so that everyone can be heard. And as at all Washington Forum events, we insist only on two things. Questions should be questions, and disagreements should be civil disagreements. Other than that, there are no rules. Our plenary speaker tonight is Amity Shlaes. She comes to us from the 4% Growth Project, an initiative for which she is the new director and which is run by the George W. Bush Institute. She came to that project from the Council on Foreign Relations, where she's the Hayek Senior Fellow on Political Economy. She did her undergraduate work at Yale University before working for a number of years in journalism, including writing columns for the Financial Times and serving on the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal. Her work has appeared in the New Yorker, the American Spectator, Commentary Magazine, Foreign Affairs, Forbes, National Review, and the New Republic. And she's now a syndicated columnist for Bloomberg News. For her journalistic work, she was a finalist for the Loeb Prize in Commentary and winner of the Frederick Bastiat Prize, an international prize for writing on political economy. She is now herself a judge for the Bastiat Prize. In the course of her career, she's also written 3 books, including Germany, The Empire Within, on German unification, reunification, The Greedy Hand, A History of American Tax Policy, and The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Depression. Her current book project, due out next spring, is a biography of Calvin Coolidge. Her plenary talk this evening is entitled Obama Plays Monopoly, The Great Depression Revisited. I hope you'll join me in welcoming Ms. Shlaes, a good friend of the Washington Forum, to speak to us tonight.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ingram. Thank you for this time. I guess we should say Bush and Obama play Monopoly, because it's all presidents that this story is about. It's a wonderful place to be. It's a perfectly appropriate place to have a debate about the Great Depression, because Dr. Vedder and Dr. Galloway wrote a book that was important for me in the writing of my book, and is important for a lot of us, on unemployment in that period. So we feel when we converge here that we're coming to some of the most important original work. I can't say how timely I think the Washington Forum event is, and I'm very glad to see all these colleagues come to debate this topic. You heard I was introduced as a Depression author. Anyone who turns to the Great Depression turns not only to the economy, but also to the culture. The culture tells you things about the economy that data can't go beyond data. It matters, for example, about the 1930s, that the Philco radios that became popular in that period were shaped like altars or cathedrals. So when President Roosevelt spoke out of his radio, it sounded like his dictates were divine. gives a new meaning to the phrase ex cathedra when you look at those radios from the period. The 30s were also a period when something else came into American living rooms, the Monopoly board game. First, the man who laid out the board game, Charles Darrow, the man who created it, couldn't sell his idea, Great Depression. In fact, Parker Brothers had a look at Monopoly, the plan, and found 52 design flaws. So you want to imagine the frustration of the entrepreneur, but they did buy it, and Monopoly did become popular. So you want to imagine people, before they listen to the fireside chat of Roosevelt, before they turn on the radio, sitting down at their card tables and playing Monopoly. And by around 1935, the New York Times is writing of all other board games. There's the big season craze, Monopoly, the game of real estate. So tonight I'm going to talk about the economy then and the economy now in the context of a board game, that game, and specifically about the mystery of recovery. Recoveries make a choice. Ours is choosing to stay away. But we're not even sure what recovery is. Where is it going to be? Where, when is it coming? Can we declare it here? But it seems to be choosing to stay away. There's some very similarities between that period and this period, and I'll try to draw them out in a way that helps us to think about how we could lure recovery back, how we do business, and I'll try to talk about it through that board. So when I say Monopoly, don't think antitrust law or anything complicated. Think about the game, living room, and the parameters of the game. More luck and less skill than some games we play, but still, there is a game. You try to build yourself an existence on that board. You buy a house, you buy another house, you get the hotel, and you pat yourself on the back and say, I'm compounding now. That little bit of satisfaction. In the Monopoly board, we have set figures. You know them, the rich people, the plutocrat, the top hat. Maybe you don't like the top hat, or maybe you always take the top hat because one day you want to be a plutocrat, a top hat. Either way, Americans have an abiding interest in the top hat token. It's never been switched out. It's always been in the game, and if you look at the game over the years, you'll see many tokens have changed, not the top hat. Your willingness to play the game of Monopoly depends on a few things. Getting a predictable number of pay income tax cards, not too many. Knowing the amount on the card for the income tax. Getting a predictable number of chance cards, not too many. Knowing the number of go to jail cards. Maybe knowing exactly what's known and what's unknown. In other words, you have to have some certainty to play Monopoly that you own what you own, that the risks to your property can be quantified. You like the community chest. I know David Beto is here. You have the primary author on voluntarism here, and you have Professor Morris, is that right? Another author on voluntarism, taking the other side to debate this issue. What role does the community play in the game? That's a question too. What else matters in a game like that? The temperament of the bank. The rules are there in the directions. There's a fixed supply of Monopoly money. Ideally, the bank follows those rules and allows himself, herself, little discretion. But we have all had the experience of playing Monopoly with a bank that overreaches. Players know what they require of a bank in the Monopoly game. The bank doesn't have to be perfect. He just has to be what? Not too bad to make you want to play the game. If the bank is too unpredictable, too discretionary, too jumpy, you know what happens. The player, you walk away from the board. There is no game. So when it comes to the Great Depression, we know the traditional narrative. The crash was important in '29. Some of you are studying that. We're talking tonight about history, but also historiography. There was an economic Katrina. The crisis was monetary. It was banking. There was a component of credit, depending on with whom you speak. Some of it was banking structure. Some of it had to do with consumers. Some of it had to do with tariffs. There's a long list of factors in that event, early 29, 30, 31, 32, some combo of that. The Fed. The terrible thing about the Great Depression overall, though, was how long it lasted, the duration of the unemployment, particularly. That's what makes it great in our memory. Unemployment over 10%, by some measures over 15% for a decade. The second thing we learn about the Great Depression, or have learned in the past, was that it was mysterious, a topic for PhDs only. Great brains were needed to explain it. Minds a standard deviation farther out than our own. Government brains in the standard teaching about this period were smarter, cleverer than average brains. That's why Roosevelt's advisors especially were called the Brains Trust. Felix Frankfurter, you might have heard the names, Francis Perkins, the Labor Secretary, Stuart Chase, George Warren, Adolph Burley. The mystery of the economics in that period, the way it's taught, is that there was a shortage of money, and there was, that only a prince of economics could understand and rectify. Corollary received ideas about the period. In the New Deal, the government knew more than the big business, and mostly the big business, it was thought, knew more than the small business. So the very small player at the monopoly board, he was almost irrelevant to the recovery story in the standard telling. Couple other presumptions I also want to mention. Cleaning up Wall Street by getting rid of white-collar criminals, and there were some, would help the nation to recovery. Maybe remove the top hats and you level society in a way that is good economics. We heard that Roosevelt was a tease. He was a man who was a tease. And he, in fact, had a joke he told about top hats. The joke is about the man wearing the tuxedo in tails, the very stereotype that's captured by that little Monopoly token, who falls into the water, but you rescue him. Roosevelt rescues him, the government rescues him, the government rescues the rich man with the economy, and you pull him back to shore, and instead of thanking you like he's supposed to for saving his life, he starts to complain that you did not rescue his top hat. This was Roosevelt's joke about the ingratitude of the wealthy, the plutocrats, for the New Deal. We have a professor here named Lee Ohanian, I'm particularly glad to see, who writes about labor, who's done the most important work about the labor in that period right now that's worth your attention, and I'm glad you're going to get to hear him. In the standard version, we learned that the Wagner Act, the big labor law, or Davis-Bacon, which was a Hoover law before it, were basically good things, helped the worker to have those labor laws. And finally, in our received description of this period, we have a cliche about the tempo of it all. What we learned in school, someone asked me about Keynesianism today, is that action in this period, because of the deflationary spiral, was crucial, and that inaction was fatal. That the government ought to do something, and you've heard the refrain, somebody ought to do something. In the early 1930s, the humorist Will Rogers wrote a description of that. He wrote of Roosevelt that if Roosevelt had burned down the Capitol, we would cheer and say, well, at least he got a fire started anyhow. That sense of agency and its relationship to economics, so that's the official version. Or to put it in terms of the monopoly board, in America in the 30s, we were failing because we had no bank. There was nobody to divide up the monopoly money. We had too many top hats lording it about, so we had a monopoly plutocracy. And we needed a strong credentialed bank, a strong hand to write it, and the New Dealers, specifically Roosevelt, materialized to be that bank. When you go back to the period, though, as I did for this book now a number of years ago, you find a different story. It starts the same. The Depression, the beginning, it was a Katrina. There was a confluence of events that was unusual and unusually destructive. There was a shortage of money, what we call deflation. it was terrible. The unemployment was terrible. You see 20 or 25% that we've all cited. And this has all been well studied by our forerunners and continues to be studied. But the rest of the evidence, in my analysis, contradicts the traditional narrative. After 2 or 3 years of digging around, I discerned one big theme: government prevented recovery. Herbert Hoover first was too active. He didn't fit the stereotype of inaction we have of him. He was not passive, and his activity was destructive. Roosevelt came along and also, in a different fashion, impeded recovery. The two men shared a quality. Temperament matters a lot in history. It's not just the data or numbers or institutions. They were both control freaks. So you have an executive who wants to control and wants to expand the control of the executive. The trouble was particularly gratuitous, unnecessary in the latter part of the 30s. The New Deal has something in common with now, but it was worse. There was a kind of calculus of frustration, the always recovering but never recovered economy. Wherein lay the damage? A few areas. I think first, hard to explain but real, was the patronizing attitude of the planners, the arrogance of planning, the arrogance of credentialism. You tell business down there, the beginner, the small man, you know as an authority, the New Deal or any government, what's going on, and whatever small business thinks, somebody down there, well, they're wrong because you know better than they do. It's a very top-down, macroeconomic way of looking at recovery, and that was the way typical in the period. The centerpiece of the New Deal came from FDR's first 100 days, the National Recovery Administration. The goal of the NRA was very dramatic, more expensive than, say, the goal of the health care law that we have or other changes that we have. It was to run the economy, basically, with an element of self-government, contradictory law, of great industries, and run the entire industrial economy through codes that were written by industries, along with approval from government. So it's kind of a murky new idea for the US and very expansive. You want to imagine an enormous multi-sector project, not a lot of clarity where it's going, and a lot of discretion for the people involved, for the rulers in those specific areas. And the rules that this law was based on were not intuitive, such as prices have to be pushed up to make recovery possible. So not. Or competition maybe should be stopped because competition impedes recovery. Big firms are good, and big firms are basically too big to fail, so we have to worship the economy of scale and give them a dominant role. The consumer choice, well, the consumer choice is questionable because it's inefficient. It takes a consumer a long time to make a choice, a Starbucks line, right? A long time, and maybe that's what's impeding recovery. If we could be more efficient, then we could get to recovery faster. Well, the absurdity of these assertions was overlooked because the assertions came from great minds. One business in the Forgotten Man I talk about that, since the rules were counterproductive, was prosecuted for violating NRA rules. They did speak up, even though they were afraid. It was the kosher chicken butcher family called the Schechters, Brooklyn butchers, who were prosecuted by the federal government for violating NRA rules. I want to read to you from a courtroom scene from that book so that you can get a feel about where law meets economics, where the law of the market meets the law of the government, and what they have to say to one another. And it's a scene of bullying or intimidation, this particular scene. It's on the one hand, you have Walter Lyman Rice, and I was very pleased to meet a scholar here today who's working on Walter Rice and racketeering. He's representing the government, prosecuting the little chicken dealer for violating the NRA. And in this particular scene, it's not a Schechter, one of the defendants who's speaking, but one of their colleagues with whom they do business named Louis Spatz. Thing to know about Spatz, chicken business, very active, very humble, kosher. Imagine immigrants in Brooklyn, and Mr. Spatz did not speak English very well. And so the question is, if you are more educated, does that mean you are right about economics? And you want to hear Spatz try to defend himself. So you have the prosecution, this would be Walter, who went to Harvard Law School, speaking to Spatz about how he knows what's right for his company. And the prosecution says, oh my gosh, but you do not claim to be an expert. Spatz, no. On the competitive practices in the live poultry industry. Well, Spatz, very intimidated. Well, I would want to be paid if I was an expert. Fighting back a little bit. You are not an expert, prosecutor. Spatz, I am experienced, but not an expert. Important distinction. You have not studied agricultural economics? No, sir. Or any other sort of economics? No, sir. What is your education? None, very little. None at all? Very little. Very little, the little guy says. At one point, this every man, this Spatz, this small player, kind of pulls himself together and to fight back. And the prosecution says, and you would not endeavor to explain economic consequences of competitive practices. Spatz says, in my business, I am the best economizer. What is that? In my business, I am the best economizer. You are the best economizer? Yes, without figuring. Spatz didn't like arithmetic, right? I wish to have that word spelled out, says the prosecution, in the minutes, just as he stated it. He wants to mock him for using a word slightly improperly. Spatz, I do not know how to spell. Why does the dialogue matter? Because in fact, little businesses like the Schechter Poultry, then and now, are the natural drivers of recovery. They weren't being allowed to do that driving. They were essentially sidelined by the regulation, the prosecution. They weren't accumulating wealth in all that period, getting to the point where you get more than one house and you begin to get that hotel. I think there's a monetary corollary to the small business problem in the story of the NRA. It has to do with the arbitrary aspect of government behavior in this period. It's very clear there wasn't enough money in the 1930s. We kind of all agree on that. So Roosevelt wanted to reflate, to put money in the economy, fair enough. But though the New Dealers' direction was right, the Fed's direction was right, the discretionary aspect of their policy was terrifying. What do I mean by discretionary? They tried all different kind of ways to make the economy reflate. It was an experiment, the experiment of the New Deal. And our monetary policy in that period, our law was new. It was only written in the teens, right? We only got the Fed in the teens. We weren't too happy with the first Fed law. It would be rewritten very shortly after this scene. So Roosevelt kind of took it upon himself personally to dump money in the economy the way he thought it should be dumped. And if you go back to the 1930s, to this period, you see him first taking us off the gold standard in 1933 and then trying different ways to get money into the economy, not really sure of how to do it. Roosevelt, as you know, had a health challenge. He worked in bed in the morning, so you imagine him in the bedroom in the White House and all the advisors are around him, and one of them is Henry Morgenthau, who would later become Treasury Secretary. So Morgenthau is there, and Roosevelt every day says, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to let the price of gold go up by X or Y by buying. And one day they're all circled around, and maybe after he's had his egg and before he's had his cigarette, the president says, let it go up by 21 cents, the price of gold. Why 21, Mr. President? Roosevelt's reply, because it's 7 times 3, and 3 is a lucky number. So Morgenthau, who is a personality in the category greatness thrust upon them, bless him, goes home to his diary and writes in his diary, if anyone knew how we set the gold price, I think they would be frightened. The discretionary aspect of it did frighten markets. You do see the stock market rally halt in the period of this experiment. The idea that Any action by me is okay, and the arbitrariness does no damage. The rules of the game suspended. The other received ideas, faith about cleaning up Wall Street, creation of the SEC. The SEC is fine. We need clarity. We probably need a national, federal clarity. It's nice to create a Securities and Exchange Commission. Too bad there's so much emphasis on prosecution and discretion in the culture of the SEC. All right, but I also saw other areas where we did damage. Their rhetoric was harsher than ours. You wouldn't get any president, Democrat or Republican, looking into a teleprompter today where the words would read, "You are princes of property," or "We seek in government an instrument of unimagined power." And these are phrases that Roosevelt did use. He wanted to scare business, to vanquish it. And business, in 1937, after his landslide reelection, there was an especially tough speech that he gave as his inaugural speech. This caused business to freeze in its tracks, because that's what you do when there's an elephant in the room, even if it's a donkey, a Democrat. You freeze if it could trample you, either party. Companies went on what Roosevelt himself spitefully or resentfully called capital strike. They said, we're going to sit on our money. The capital strikers mattered. They matter now. They are the ones who play to kill. They are the ones who could pour money into the economy and are not. Roosevelt in the New Deal countered. How did he counter? He fought back by writing an undistributed profits tax, which, if we would use the metaphors, say, of Harry Potter, would be like a Dementor or a Voldemort of a tax, undistributed profits tax. Because what it does is, if you don't spend money as a company, that money is taken away. It eats away at the essence, the savings of your company, unless you disgorge that money either through dividends or wages. So that was a rough counter blow from Roosevelt to businesses' decision to hold on to their money. Maybe they were right. In the later 30s, there was a banker of Cleveland Trust Company, I noticed this because of where we are, who wrote in the Times that companies couldn't spend and they couldn't make money, they just had to sit on the money, and noted that for nearly a decade now, the great majority of corporations have been losing money instead of making it. That begins to sound familiar. The uncertainty ensured the duration of the trouble. Regarding big labor, I know you're going to hear from Professor Ohanian what he will show, what he has the data to show, and he's also writing a book about this, is that while the labor movement was romantic, it was also destructive. So you have the Wagner Act of 1935. That act was the law we have now is a little neutered pussycat next to the big terrifying tiger of the Wagner Act. It was a rough law. These sit-down strikes were not yet adjudicated. It wasn't clear whether you could do a sit-down strike or not. That was a property threat from the point of view of the company. The closed shop, wasn't clear whether we'd have that. Seemed like we would. That was very rough. You had to be in the shop to work at the office. Very hard for employers. And it gave unions enormous power. What Lee and others have found, he works with Harold Cole, and I noticed this only after writing The Forgotten Man, is you have an anomalous event, which is wages are too high in the later 30s relative to the trend for the century. What? Wait a minute, unemployment was so high. How could wages be high if unemployment was so very bad in this period? Well, wages were high because employers were concerned, and the government was all Democratic, all for this labor law, so maybe they better just pay that money. But it's a very rough deal when you have to pay wages you can't afford in a fragile economy. You think of the phrases we have from that period, and they reflect that. What I heard in Chicago when I grew up was, it was all right if you had a job. That's what I heard about the Great Depression, but you didn't always have a job. Or the song that actually became popular in the 1930s, written in the 1930s, nice work if you can get it. A large divide between those who had a job and those who didn't. A sad divide, not the fluidity that we seek. We say recoveries make a choice. That recovery chose to stay away. So 36, 37, 38, 39, getting there, stops, reverses. the rally fizzles. In short, the problem of this period of the Great Depression, the Great Game Board, was not no bank. It was too much bank in the form of the federal government. The bank was worse than not too bad. The bank was terrible. It fooled around with the money. It was too aggressive. It was arbitrary. It was a bully. It took advantage of its bank status to make itself the most powerful player. It shoved others aside to monopolize. One person who saw this I came to like very much from Indiana, Wendell Willkie. I'm going to Rushville shortly to tape about him. He was a businessman and a Democrat, ran Commonwealth and Southern, a utilities company. And they had an idea that they would light up the South with this utilities company and found themselves in an enormous battle with the government lighting up the South through the Tennessee Valley Authority. Finally, he said in a speech, well, you know, the New Deal is telling us a bedtime story about what they're doing for the economy, but they're also squeezing out companies like mine in the most innovative sectors, in the sectors where the growth would come that would give us the recovery of the quality we desire. I don't think it's hard, if Willkie were here, it would be hard for him to see the similarities. There are a number. The arrogance up top is important, and it's bipartisan. Our government recalls the 30s in its disregard for non-government parties. You get the feeling from all governments that they regard the rest of the country sort of misty, way out there, not really part of the story. The idea is that if leaders are very credentialed, they must be right. We've had very fine names leading our economic policy with lots of credentials. Not so clear that the policy they're promulgating, notwithstanding the high quality of their academic work and education, is adequate, that the theory they believe in, Keynesianism or modern macro affected by Keynesianism, actually applies, actually is the answer for recovery. The idea that a crisis is an opportunity for progressive reform, that's why that quote from Rahm Emanuel was repeated so very often. A crisis is a terrible thing to waste because it's bold. You take a reform that has to do, a crisis that has to do with housing and money and banks and turn it into a story about healthcare. That's very similar to the New Deal and what they did, turn crisis into reform opportunity. Our government tends to overlook any effect that, any counterproductive effect that unions might have, especially public sector unions. You see that in the auto deal, which saved the industry and put the union members ahead of some of the creditors. Why does that matter? Why should we care? Because the creditors won't buy the bonds again, won't lend again so easily next time if they are treated unexpectedly, rudely, if they are made second out of precedent in the history of bankruptcy law. I think a disregard, finally, for the micro experience of what it's actually like to be a small business, what an auto dealer loses, what we lose down there when government moves around. But the biggest similarity I see of all, is monetary. And that's the one that preoccupies us. I can wager that next year your conference will be a monetary conference, because we have this federal policy of that there must be more money, but it's quite discretionary how the government goes about it, whether it's the Treasury through Operation Twist we've heard about just now, or QE3 that's coming, or QE2 move forward, or QE1. Who knows how much money should go in the economy? None of us knows how much. And what's clear is that it's an arbitrary choice by someone very educated, but nonetheless arbitrary. That's the problem at issue. The authority that the Fed has comes from a bank law, from a Fed law that was written off the New Deal, the Employment Act written subsequent to World War II. So these behaviors come out of those behaviors. Modern behavior by the government comes out of New Deal precedent and New Deal institutions. I don't see it all dark at all, because when the market is way down, that's an opportunity for someone just entering it. When the game is way low, that's when you get in the game. The board reminds us that the environment doesn't have to be perfect for new players to come in, for an economy to get going again. It just, again, has to be not too bad. growth isn't merely about animal spirits or something mysterious. It's about the impulse of a younger person, especially an entrepreneur, to think, it's not too bad, I'll give it a try. I wrote a column this week, a night I published about Steve Jobs and the terrible environment he was operating in when he went into a business that required venture capital. When he started to fool around, cap gains, which are important for that industry, were taxed at 50%. It went down. An incredibly high series of interest rates were coming as the Fed clamped down. So there were periods when there were 22% car loans, and house loans were not much less expensive than that. And yet he persevered, and some things went his way. The cap gains tax rate did change, and he created so much that was growth for our economy. So in the darkness, there's a silver lining. There are entrepreneurs who are ready to work just so long as it's not too bad. What do we do to make it not too bad this time? Basic respect for the rules, not as much intervention as we've had from any government, more respect for the entrepreneur, the man who wants to keep his monopoly money, property rights. But recovery, the main thing is that recovery won't come back to us because of a reform at the top. It will come back right here, down there on the board, one house or hotel at a time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your remarks. I want to identify myself a little bit and then ask a very large question. I'm an emeritus engineering professor here on the Ohio University campus, and in my undergraduate engineering exercise, I learned a great deal about some laws that govern the universe. They're called the laws of thermodynamics. One of them especially is called the entropy law, the second law of thermodynamics. My question is, when are economists going to learn something about the physical laws that control the universe, especially the second law of thermodynamics, the entropy law, which says that the economic process is an entropic process and the planet cannot tolerate it with continual growth, and more growth? Could you respond to that, please?
Thank you. So the question is, the law of thermodynamics, entropy, growth doesn't seem to fit in with that? Is that?
That's correct. The second law of thermodynamics says that the growth and the consumption that's going on planet Earth with all 7 billion and pretty soon much more people can't go on forever. We must work on zero growth, non-growth economic systems.
But I heard that on the radio too, just this week. We've grown a lot and we're not out of food yet. It's sort of like Malthus from the old days. He worried, well, population was growing geometrically, maybe food couldn't keep up, maybe it grew just plussing and plussing arithmetically, but then through productivity gains, because we figured out how to grow food better, we were able to make enough food all along. And on NPR, they were worrying that the desire for food, or the need for food, demand for food would double, and that would be a problem. It hasn't been a problem so far. It's hard to see in the short and medium term that it would be a problem. So I don't see the need for zero growth.
Well,
myself.
Excuse me, the economy, the global warming that is affecting the planet is because of this continual growth in the consumption of resources and turning them into high entropy waste that cannot be reused. That's the second law of thermodynamics, and it's going to continue. My question is, when are economists going to start learning the second law of thermodynamics and including that natural physical law into their economic laws?
The energy problem is an important problem, but it's a discrete problem. Personally, I wouldn't universalize it, though I understand your sentiment. Thank you. Okay. Next question.
Sorry. Thank you. You talked a lot about small businesses, this long story about the chicken dealer. And you also mentioned, was it Burley who was on the cabinet? I know a little bit about him. His work dated from the turn of the century. He wrote about the corporation. Even at that time, like 20 years before FDR, Burley and Means were reporting that virtually all the productive capital in this country and the world was in large corporate hands. Why are we talking about small businesses as being some kind of thing that could turn around the Depression?
Burley and Means were eminent economists, Columbia. It's amazing how eminent they were considering how wrong they were. And the easy way to look at that is, where is job creation now in the United States? The places that create more jobs faster are small businesses. You say, where does job creation happen? Small businesses. So there are always big corporations. They often fail of their own accord. They creatively destruct themselves through big errors. It wasn't big corporations who made the Great Depression, and it wasn't big corporations who made the recovery. So they were interesting scholars. Some companies were too big. Plenty of companies were too big by the end of the 20s. Would they have fallen of their own accord because of their bulky size? I believe so. It's a counterfactual. Some were already showing signs of falling, but it was not big companies that caused the Depression, and it was certainly small business that, in every recovery, small business is important, and new businesses arrive, and they're the ones who create the jobs. I was talking to a colleague of mine at the Bloomberg, and he said, "What's the next big idea?" And I said, "I'm not sure what the next big idea is." He says, "All I'm sure of is that the recovery won't come from the government. It'll come from some big idea that generates growth in the U.S. that someone will have who's not even known yet, who's not picked." So we say in economics, the government, when it hands out subsidies, picks losers. They go to the weak, and the winners are not even evident, and they're almost entirely tiny people. A la, I don't want to tire us all out with Steve Jobs, but a la Steve Jobs, in that period before the capital gains rate was cut in 1976, doing something or other in his garage. I looked at the Wall Street Journal coverage of Steve Jobs and Apple in preparation for this column, and what I found was a very condescending attitude in the later 70s about Apple. So they would write things like, "Small computers makers such as blah, 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 Tandy and Apple say that they don't need money from Wall Street." What's that about? And then when Apple went public, and there's a very wonderful story in the Wall Street Journal somewhere in that period where it says, the personal computer has been invented, and guess what? I'm going to paraphrase the headline. It was something like, "Investors find a use for a personal computer," wrote the Wall Street Journal in wonderment. They discovered that people were running scenarios and doing mini forecasting on their own, and very, very primitive computers that Apple first produced. What a shock. Investors use computers to count things up and to think about their portfolios. We had no idea that a small company like Apple would change us as much as it did. So that's where the story is, in my view, of recovery as well as downturn.
Of the many different interpretations that are out there of the New Deal and FDR's policies, as opposed to your study, The Forgotten Man, you see it as though he is squashing out business and entrepreneurial growth. But there's another interpretation that states that his policies actually saved the capitalist system. And I was just wondering how your interpretation meshes with that. Is there room for that or not? In particular, if you look at the labor strikes and the Wagner Act, one of the arguments is that, well, the Wagner Act gave strikers legal recourse that they could funnel their angst into. So you have previously movements that were communist influence in them, but the strikes were getting less violent as the 30s wore on. That's just one area. I was just wondering how that larger idea fits with yours.
Thank you for that important question. The question is, did Roosevelt save capitalism, or the New Deal save capitalism instead of hurt it? It did specifically the Wagner Act give labor standing and thereby tamp down the most revolutionary rage that we had with that terrible unemployment, and therefore be a benefit. The question is, were we on the brink of revolution? And I believe this is an event about history and how it's described, that the reports that we were on the brink of revolution did exaggerate. That this country was not on, what I find when I go back to look at the papers of the period, I did not find a country on the brink of revolution. This question was asked me often, but when I started this book, and I was living in Germany on a fellowship, so the Germans always ask this, we were a long way from Germany in that period. And one writer, Odette Coyne, came over to report on the labor revolution around the time of the Wagner Act. And she was not a right-winger, but she was a good reporter, an honest reporter. And what she wrote in her report, again, I paraphrase, but it was basically, the flabbergasting thing about the American worker that I have discovered on my reporting trip is that he is conservative. The U.S. was a much more phlegmatic country, very angry, very disappointed, very much in trouble with this abiding joblessness. But not so revolutionary. So the argument that Roosevelt saved us, I find exaggerated. I don't think we needed that much saving. And we hear it a lot from Europeans, because Europe was in more trouble than we were, especially continental Europe. I think it exaggerates the temper, the tone. And I would commend to you, for example, the writings by the Linns, Middletown, about the 1930s. It was the second volume. They went back to Middletown, which they studied in the 20s. And you find a very miserable, disappointed, struggling town, to be sure, but not a town of revolutionists. And where there were revolutionists, they were not many. The most revolutionary period, I'm writing the Coolidge bio right now, the most revolutionary period I have encountered is 1919. When you see what people were saying in the port of Boston, and the Latvians wanted to have a revolution, and very, very close spiritually Boston at that moment to the revolutionary ports of Russia and to the UK, where there was ferment. That was a time where there was unrest. You don't see that so much in the 1930s overall, given how abiding the unemployment was. So I don't think we needed to be saved. That's what I found when I looked at the period. I want to say something about Roosevelt that we talked about today, and then go on. Why is Roosevelt loved so much? Because Professor Galloway did an interesting counterfactual. I'll tell you why he's loved so much, and I love him myself. It was because he was on the right side of World War II. And he led us very well. He's a military temperament, and actually he was a naval president. He knew every crack and corner of the East Coast and how to maneuver a craft in and out of it. A master sailor, really, and or boatman, let's just say. I don't know the word. And he was comfortable with war, and he was right about World War II. The Nazis were bad. We had to go over there, and all of us love him for that. So working backwards from that, because history is not logical, teachers are not logical. Working backwards for that. We know the New Deal is a hard period, the Great Depression is a hard period. As I said, it's mysterious. We're going to overlook the infelicities of the New Deal because he did save the world for democracy, or democracy for the world, with World War II. That is true. Whether democracy needed saving in the 30s, I contest, and have found lots of evidence for my contesting. So you want me to? I think you've got authority over there.
Oh, great, 2 microphones. Hi, Amity, I'm Brian Ballo, University of Virginia. Thanks for your talk. I was surprised at the emphasis you put on small business in the recovery. And since you've said such terrific things about Roosevelt and World War II, and since the talk is about the political economy, I'd be curious to hear your view on the role of World War II in the recovery, and specifically the role of big business in World War II and the recovery.
Do you want the, let's do the 1 minute version. The question behind the question of Professor Ballard from UVA is, did the spending of World War II take us out? And isn't that an argument for spending? Because the spending of World War II was far greater than the spending of the New Deal. You see the federal government having this enormous presence in the economy in the 30s, excuse me, in the war. I think the real way to answer that is the real question about the Great Depression is not how did World War II end it, is why did that gosh darn depression last all the way to that war? It's extremely anomalous for us to have a depression that goes that long. So you have spending that comes along, World War II, and did it feel like a shot in the arm? Yes. What happened with big business? That was the second part of your question. Big business was terrified of the New Deal. I read you that 37 inaugural speech where President Roosevelt said he wanted an instrument of unimagined power. He was going to make his antagonist business clearly. He was going to show them he was their master. That was something he said in 1936. Then what happened? Roosevelt got bored with chasing business. The downturn was pretty bad. They realized they were hurting business. Morgenthau, again, a limited character, but by now an experienced Treasury Secretary, said, you have to be nice to business. Roosevelt, time to time, talked about breathing spells. Roosevelt did, the Democrats did relatively poorly in the 38 midterms. Seemed like the high tide of the New Deal had passed. The water was going back. Roosevelt, again, was not really interested in economics. He's a naval person. The threat of war was nearing, and what do we have to do for war? Well, we have to prepare for it, even if we're not going to go in it. And we're going to call the same people we were chasing around the lot every other week, to use Keynes's phrase, we're going to call them to the White House or to a meeting and give them a contract to make something, like aluminum, provide something, aluminum for something else. So business was very relieved in this period, and that relief is important. And then business also, they weren't the enemy anymore, they were the ally in the great campaign, Lend-Lease, and then the war itself. So that was important for business, as important or more important as the actual value of the contracts, I think. And did they spend and did we spend? Yes. Did we get unemployment? We don't know. I don't count wartime service in a draft as reemployment. I count it as something else in the other sphere. So we can't say we reduced unemployment by World War II. We don't say we reduce unemployment now by sending people to Iraq or Afghanistan. A lot of people went in the war. There was the draft. Unemployment went down in a very satisfying way, but I disregard wartime service as employment. So did unemployment eventually go down? Yes, but the New Deal was also over. You see that Taft-Hartley, the law that reduced the Wagner Act, that neutered it, came pretty soon after the war. There was a view among both people of both parties that the New Deal had gone too far. It was very clear. You see that in the amendment to the Constitution to limit the number of terms the president can serve. You see it in Taft-Hartley. We'd had enough with the drama of the New Deal post-war. So it was never quite like that again, and business was very relieved indeed.
Thanks. I wanted to ask about the 1920s, going back the other way, because particularly with your presentation of Hoover as a control freak, I'm thinking about the growth of the 1920s and Hoover making his reputation as Secretary of Commerce as someone that's prepared to use the power of government to be able to help business, and leading to his success and his prominence in the 1920s. So I'd like to know your opinions on that, and if it wasn't a problem for the growth of the 1920s, why does that suddenly become a problem after 1929?
But Hoover wasn't president for most of the 20s. He was a commerce secretary out of favor, right? Coolidge didn't like Hoover. President Coolidge, he said, that man has brought me maybe, I can't remember, maybe he said 1 million ideas or 100, many ideas, all of them bad. Coolidge called Hoover Wonder Boy, and that was not a friendly way. He didn't mean it friendly. Coolidge gave Hoover tasks. He had tasks. They involved radio. He went down when we had the big flood, you know, and and organized the Red Cross and did it. Hoover was very good at rescue, but he certainly wasn't running the economy. Coolidge tried to shut him out like so much noise. He understood that Hoover was popular in the party. He understood that it might be inevitable that Hoover would become president, but he was not particularly for Hoover, and his policies were not particularly Hoover-esque. There are progressive aspects to federal policy in the 20s, but nothing like what we saw after, and progressive generally see the 20s as a period of stop or retreat for a progressive movement. So Coolidge was the man who mattered till March 29. I like Hoover. I sort of have pity him because he's so hated, and there is a lot of good in him. His analysis of Russia, his analysis of what happened at Versailles and the treaty afterwards, as Keynes noticed, was spot on. He was a great rescuer. You would want him to run your hospital or your war, but Coolidge just couldn't stand him, and so that was an uncomfortable situation for both of them. Sebastian.
Yes. You mentioned an example in which part of the New Deal legislation obliged businessmen or business owners to put labor in front of creditors when it came time to it. That sounds a lot like a dichotomy between capital and labor, and if the way to go is to put creditors before labor in a critical situation, if we assume that that's the soundest economical decision, how do you sell that decision to the people who actually depend on wages and who actually feel protected by that sort of legislation? In other words, how do you make it politically feasible and sellable in an atmosphere in which most people depend on a monthly wage?
So the question is, are labor and capital opposed? And did I, by mentioning that creditors were unexpectedly subordinated to labor in auto deals, what was that about? And I think it's very hard to distinguish between capital. The reason that the creditors should have gone first is because that was the precedent. And when you break precedent, you scare markets, and those markets include many laborers. The most interesting suit vis-a-vis the automakers is the suit from Indiana, where people whose pensions were affected by the rearrangement of precedent when that auto fix was done by the federal government, sued to say it was wrong to change the rules. The terms on which they or their representatives bought these bonds or lent money were not observed by changing the old precedent. And the people who lost out in Indiana who had these pensions were not very big deal people. They were laborers or something close to it, teachers, not rich people. So where is capital and where is labor? I'm not so comfortable with that distinction. I see it more as the entrepreneurs. Most people are entrepreneurial, some less than the other. Anyway, small actors, not a class war. The problem with the New Deal was that it occasionally, not always, made class war on the small or on the rich. We're all everything. We all have a component of plutocrat, of top hat, and of labor in us, and we're all that in different times. What do you call someone who starts a business in his home? Is he a laborer or is he a future plutocrat? I mean, somewhere in between. So that's what I would say for that. Even the outcome there hurt everyone, including laborers, because they were the ones who held the pension that lost value because the government acted unpredictably, breaking its own precedents on bankruptcy law.
Yes, I believe so.
Yes? Okay. Oh, I get two questions. I'm excited. You mentioned World War II and that FDR was on the right side, and I think everybody agrees that Nazis were bad. But when you did your research, did you come across any of the things that FDR and Thurman Arnold, for example, said about fascism, what it consisted of? Private business buying the government?
I'm not familiar with Thurman Arnold wrote about fascism.
Was he Attorney General? Yes, I think.
It was antitrust.
Yeah. At any rate, FDR talked a lot about that, and he talked about how the danger was not mainly foreign for Americans, but it was domestic.
The domestic fascists? FDR was all over the map on that. I mean, there's a wonderful book by Professor Hawley about New Deal antitrust policy, and what you find is they switch positions all the time because they weren't sure. So in one of the most extraordinary diary items I read in this book, in researching this book, was Rex Tugwell of the New Deal going over to see Mussolini and seeing some of Mussolini's fascist housing developments along the water in marsh areas that hadn't been developed before, and admiring it. Rex Tugwell was not a fascist, really, although he liked a lot of fascist ideas. He wasn't a traitor. He didn't work for Mussolini or Stalin, but he was very much enamored of the bigness of it. Then you see flipping. They loved the economy of scale that you can see in fascism. There's a great romance with the economy. Bigger is better. Sizeism. We talked about that in a when you really love something big because it seems more efficient. Well, you might as well farm 1,000 acres. You might as well farm 5,000 acres. Where can you get 5,000 acres? Well, Stalin might give them to you. U.S. ag expert went over and farmed 10,000 acres for Stalin. What a great experiment. It's just like going to China now. What a huge market. There's an appeal to that that the New Dealers really felt, and they were attracted to fascism. After a while, they were disgusted by fascism, depending what day of the week it was. They were quite concerned that they weren't able to get recovery, and they became desperate and tried stuff and then turned away. And it was that switching back and forth on antitrust, big or small, that made the recovery slower in the later 30s. So you can find stuff all. Thurman Arnold himself, I believe, switched quite a bit once he went into office. You can find them all over the map. There's not a consistency. There's a consistency to the damage, but not a consistency to the policy. Is that okay?
Hi. I was thinking of one other piece of the Monopoly Board that you didn't mention initially, but I think could be brought up. And as we can see on the screen, railroads were present, certainly in a special place on the Monopoly Board. And
are you the deregulation expert?
I wouldn't call myself an expert,
There's
but
somebody
perhaps
here. I know
experienced.
there's someone who's writing a paper about that, though. Is that you?
That's me. Yeah.
Oh, great. Yeah. Uh-huh.
But my question relates to a comment that you make briefly in The Forgotten Man about the discussion of nationalization of railroads. And
yes. Someone writes in his diary that that's got to happen.
Was he or she part of the New Deal or the Brain Trusters, and to what extent?
I'm thinking it was Taussig, right, who wrote. Somebody, I don't remember, I don't have the book in front of me, but someone did write in his diary about Tugwell, and that they thought they should nationalize, or might have to, right?
Correct.
Yeah, in the later 30s, this is, yeah.
And do you know to what extent nationalization of railroads or other special large industries played a role in either the rhetoric the White House was giving or discussions within the White House?
I don't know the research answer to that in that period. In working on the Coolidge book that I'm reading now, I'm reading, is his name Albro Martin? Yeah, that's very good. What I'm beginning to see is that the Hepburn Act, which is a much earlier act, beginning of the century, regulating railroad, and a few other acts were quite destructive. Some of the people in the room might have seen the Ayn Rand movie, the Atlas Shrugged movie. Anyway, it's about Ayn Rand, the libertarian, has an obsession with railroads. And I always thought, why are railroads important? We know they're losers, right? Amtrak, in our adulthood. But railroads had enormous promise. And they did have economy of scale in a good way. And and what I'm discovering in researching Coolidge bio is the extent to which they were trashed by progressive regulators. The role in the Panic of 1907, of the Hepburn Act, the incredible assault upon the railroads by regulators that made the industry weaker and weaker and weaker, so that autos became more attractive. And I'm finding I'm disliking, this trashing by federal progressives, TR culture, Theodore Roosevelt culture, because they killed a really important industry, important even now to us, and underperforming and sickly and, a chronic case. So is that if the New Dealers wanted to nationalize railroads, they weren't that different from Theodore Roosevelt's culture in that. So that's not that much farther than from what the progressives were saying at the turn of the century. And I hadn't known that, but I know it now, looking at railroads and particularly the New Haven and the fight over the New Haven.
Right. Sorry, what? Oh.
You want to say something?
I was just wondering.
Can't see you.
I'm way back here.
Can't see you, yeah. I see you now.
Okay. I was just wondering how you'd respond to the idea that while not necessarily ending the Depression, the New Deal helped hold the country together until World War II with programs such as like the WPA or the Civilian Conservation Corps, by at least giving people the hope that the government was doing something, that they'd be able to work and preserving like skills and for the workforce. I was just wondering how you would respond to that idea.
Well, I think Professor Rauchwey might be here. In his book, there's a lot of material on them. I don't think they're so terrible. The WPA, the youth, somebody else is writing about the National Youth Administration. Even the PWA had a remarkably small quotient of corruption relative to the scale of its outlays, which was billions. So I think they're fine. Some of them I find more intrusive than others. I guess the PWA because of the scale. The precedents they set were troubling. They certainly gave people hope. We all have relatives who got hope from those programs. So that's the humanity of the New Deal. Some of them are lovable, against which you have to balance the absence of jobs, of real jobs, the staying away of those jobs. So those programs are nice. They did something for a while. But where is the real job that's supposed to come after? And then you say, why did it stay away? Mainly because of other parts of the New Deal, like the NRA or policies I just described. I think they're part of the story, but not all of it. The presumption longer term that the government can answer everything and the government is responsible for job creation is a troubling one that has destroyed jobs since then. So again, you have to weigh what we lose now against the humanity of giving someone who is hungry a job in 1934. A very rough trade-off.
Is this working? Okay. I have two questions, if I can squeeze them in. They're both kind of big, so feel free to punt on one. You've mentioned repeatedly that you see sort of government as doing harm in many instances. I wonder what then you see the role of government being in the economy in general, or what you think the ideal one is. Secondly, a lot of what you said seemed to suggest that so-called experts are also wrong a lot, and so what role should experts or aspiring experts try to play in the conversation? How can they help rather than hinder?
Well, this is my way, thank you. It's pretty simple, and that's why I picked this Gameboard metaphor. Rules-based game, rules-based economy where the rules are written, not too many rules, not too much discretion. So when you create an entity where it's all about prosecution, that leaves a lot of discretion to the authorities, or investigation, the SEC. The aspect of the SEC that is rules, some of us don't like some of the SEC rules, okay. Some of us don't like the Volcker rule, some do. Okay, at least it's a rule. And the question is the enforcement of it so arbitrary and the range so wide that that itself is problematic? That's what I'm trying to emphasize. It's if you make the rules to the U.S. economy, maybe even if you don't like some of the rules, the game will be played, the economy will grow, but if you give the authorities too much discretion, people will sit it out. So what would an example of reform be that made it more rules-based, our system? One that I've worked on is a change to the Fed law that makes clear that only money and not growth is the mandate of the Fed. Because right now the Fed's job is everything. The Fed is like a cardiologist, or excuse me, a cardiosurgeon, even higher, right? That says everything is about the heart. Look, the economy's having a heart attack. I have to fix it. I'm the heart surgeon. Clear away other doctors and homeopaths. I'm the highest medic. But what if the problem of the economy is endocrine? Does the cardiosurgeon see that? No, his sense of agency, whether it's Bernanke, Chairman Bernanke, or Chairman Greenspan, is such that his idea of his importance is such that it must be the Fed, and the Fed law perpetuates that. It's not Bernanke or Greenspan, it's the law that gives them the job assignment to run everything as it's interpreted by our presidents and our Congress. Change the law so the job of the Fed is real narrow. It's hard enough to watch money. It's going to be hard enough to prevent inflation. Hard enough to ask for one person, or one team. Why let them some days decide they're managing growth and other days decide they're just managing bonds? It's way, way too discretionary, the mandate of the Fed. So it's that specific point I'm trying to make, that if, and you know, I talked about Americans and sectors, we're an international economy, we're dependent on foreign players. The Chinese investor, the one who buys the bonds, what's he looking for from the US? Not perfection, relative safety, relative growth, relative consistency. So we depend on that to keep our interest rate low, 222. And what do we send instead? A signal that we are very arbitrary and narcissistic about our history, that it's all about us, our history, the New Deal, our tradition, blah, blah, blah. It's not about us. We're in an international marketplace, and we have to offer an adequate game for foreigners to play in as well. So that's the danger. If we kind of do too much New Deal nostalgia and bring it back, we drive away those foreign investors. Then we have real trouble. That's when we have real trouble. If they go away too, where the interest rates go and so on. So we haven't even experienced that yet, them leaving. And it's a kind of hubris for us to assume that we will always be so attractive that we can do these experiments whenever we feel like them. We're not necessarily always the currency of reserve. I think almost, right? Almost done? One last question?
Is it me? Okay. So you said that the small business is the answer to this. If the small
is an important answer.
An important answer. Obviously, there's no one answer, but an important answer. So my question is, if people aren't spending money, the customers aren't spending money, and they're not going into those small businesses are cutting back on their employees. Where are they getting the money to run other than going out and getting bank loans? And yet the customers still aren't coming in. So how are they the answer?
What the lady's asking is, doesn't demand matter? Is that what you're really asking?
No.
So what are you asking?
I'm wondering where the money's coming from for the small business. You said that if they are free to open their doors and run a small business and have great ideas.
Where do they, if they go to the bank, they don't get the loan, and that's the problem.
They don't get the loan, but even if the interest rates are low and they do get the loan.
Well, I agree with that.
They're waiting for the customers to come in, and they don't want to spend the money.
Well, in the instance of the sectors, their problem was not credit. It was a regulator. So what you're saying is today the problem might be credit, notwithstanding lots of advertisements about credit. It's not there when you go in the bank. That's so true. Why is that? So you want to ask yourself, why is credit, which is supposed to be so available with interest rates actually negative or close to negative, with money so flowing, why can't the small business get the money? And my own interpretation is that it's regulation. The long interaction with the bank about this recently, not for me, but in a policy issue, and there are so many constraints on, they're supposed to be able to loan, they say they want to lend, but they're very afraid of losing money, of a loan going bad. They're very afraid of the regulators, so they have, it's like a lot of for rent signs, and you go in and the apartment is not available. It's kind of a lie, this credit, and it's a terrible problem. So then you have to ask, why is it a lie? What are they afraid of? And some of that is is regulation, especially bank regulation. And does the new consumer bank law help that? Maybe not. I don't think so. I think it's too discretionary. In the name of protecting consumers, it makes credit not be there. Yeah, I mean, I'm not familiar with Ohio law and Ohio situation, and some of this credit story is very, very state determined as well. But it is there, and to have the threat that they might be abusing the consumer, you see it in the credit card statements you get, whatever state you live in. The bank is so much barricading itself against litigation from you, aided by new consumer protectors, that it's actually reducing the quality of its service to you. It's warning you it's going to have all these penalties, it's going to back out, it can't guarantee you, it won't talk to you. That is the perverse result of consumer protection, often in terms of legislation. So we're going to wrap up?
Yeah, I think we'll let that be the last question. I will just say that we will be starting tomorrow morning at 8:45. There will be a plenary session with Eric Rauschway and Brian Domitrovic, and sessions will go throughout the day in Bentley 240. And I hope if you've liked what you've heard tonight, you will come around for other views and debate tomorrow. Maybe now we can obey the first law of hospitality and thank Ms. Shlaes for her talk tonight.
Major funding for the George Washington Forum is provided by the Charles G. Koch Charitable Foundation, the Apgar Foundation, the Veritas Fund for Higher Education Reform, and the Thomas W. Smith Foundation. For more information, please visit us on the web at www.ohio.edu/WashingtonForum. Thank you.